Ready to dive into some pretty intense history. We're talking the Troubles in Northern Ireland today.
Yeah, this is one of those conflicts that really gets under your skin when you start to understand it.
Absolutely. It's layered, complex.
And full of perspectives we don't always hear about.
Right, and we're lucky to have some fantastic source material for this deep dive. It goes deep, covering everything from the historical context and key players to the formation of paramilitary groups, the peace process, even the impact on everyday life.
It's a comprehensive look for sure. We're talking centuries of tension between Unionists and Nationalists.
Yeah, and that's where we'll start. I mean, to really grasp the Troubles, we need to understand the roots of that conflict. So we've got Unionists, primarily Protestant, wanting to stay part of the UK, right?
Exactly.
And the Nationalists, primarily Catholic, fighting for a united Ireland.
And both sides carrying a lot of historical baggage.
The source material really digs into the plantation of Ulster in the 17th century.
Oh, that was a pivotal point. English and Scottish Protestants encouraged to settle, displacing the native Irish Catholics, establishing that Protestant majority.
It's like the seeds of division were sown right there, and it all eventually erupted into the violence of the Troubles.
A powder keg, waiting for a spark.
And from that tension, that deep division, emerged the paramilitary organizations on both sides.
Think about it. When people feel like their identity, their way of life is under threat, they often resort to extreme measures to protect what they believe in.
So where does the British government fit into all of this? I mean, they were trying to keep the peace, but also seen as an occupying force by many nationalists.
They were stuck in a tough spot. Some of their policies, like internment without trial, aimed at stopping the violence, but actually
Backfired.
totally alienated the Catholic population even more.
And then there's Bloody Sunday, January 30th, 1972.
A horrific day. British troops firing on unarmed civil rights demonstrators, killing 14 people.
Tragic. A major turning point in the conflict.
It's a stark reminder, of how quickly things can escalate, how misunderstandings and force can have devastating consequences.
To really get this, though, we need to understand those core ideologies at play, right? Unionism and nationalism.
Absolutely. They're not just abstract concepts. They shape identities, communities, whole ways of life.
The source material even quotes Sir James Craig, the first Prime Minister of Northern Ireland. He said, "All I boast is that we are a Protestant parliament and a Protestant state."
Powerful statement. It shows just how entrenched those ideologies were.
And it's vital to remember that this wasn't just some theoretical debate. We're talking about real people, real lives, impacted by this conflict.
Source does a great job of illustrating the human cost of the Troubles. It's a picture of daily life in a society where bomb blasts become so commonplace that people learn to sleep through them. It's about the normalization of violence, the coping mechanisms people had to develop just to survive.
And the trauma, right? The PTSD, the depression, the anxiety.
Those are scars that linger long after the conflict itself is over. The deep, enduring impact of violence and instability.
We often forget about the women in all of this, too. Their roles, their experience.
Absolutely. We can't just relegate them to the category of victim. They were active participants, both in the conflict itself and in the peace process.
Bernadette Michalski is a great example.
Oh, she's inspiring. A prominent Irish nationalist and socialist activist, she was shot and severely injured by loyalist gunmen in 1970s.
She didn't back down.
No, she continued to fight for her cause. Her story, and so many others, show the resilience and courage of women during the Troubles. They were involved in everything, from paramilitary organizations and political movements to peace-building initiatives.
So let's shift gears a bit and talk about how this conflict finally started moving towards peace.
This is a long road, right?
Decades, yeah. It ultimately led to the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, but the path to get there.
Winding, for sure. So what were the key components of that agreement? What made it work, at least to some degree? It was all about addressing the core issues, creating a framework for lasting peace. We're talking power sharing between Unionists and Nationalists, the decommissioning of weapons, the release of paramilitary prisoners.
Huge steps.
Monument. But it wasn't a perfect solution. The source doesn't shy away from that. There were setbacks, challenges.
The collapse of the Northern Ireland Assembly in 2002.
Exactly. And even though the agreement was signed, dissident paramilitary groups were still active. The peace process was, and still is, incredibly fragile.
Speaking of those paramilitary organizations, they weren't just random groups of the people, right? They were deeply intertwined with the ideologies we've been talking about.
Oh, absolutely. Their actions, their goals, everything was driven by their vision for the future of Northern Ireland.
The source goes into detail about specific groups like the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, and the Ulster Defense Association, the UDA.
And it's interesting to see how their structures, their tactics, even their goals reflect the complexities of the whole conflict.
It's striking how their actions were interpreted so differently depending on who you asked.
Totally. Freedom fighters to some, terrorists to others. It all comes down to perspective, where you stand in this incredibly complex situation.
And those complexities didn't just vanish with the Good Friday Agreement.
No, they continue to shape the political and social landscape of Northern Ireland to this day.
And we can't forget about the key figures, right? The leaders, the politicians, the activists, their actions, their motivations played a huge role in how this all unfolded.
We've mentioned a few already, like Jerry Adams and Ian Paisley, but the source delves into others on both sides of the divide.
It's not just about their political moves, though. It's about their ideologies, their beliefs, even their personal histories.
The source talks about Sir James Craig's profound fear of Catholic dominance.
Whether justified or not, that fear had a massive impact on his actions as prime minister.
It's fascinating how individual beliefs and actions, combined with this larger historical and political context, created the perfect storm that became the Troubles.
It makes you think, about how our own beliefs and actions, even in seemingly small ways, can ripple out and affect the world around us.
Absolutely. It's a powerful thought.
And speaking of ripple effects, the Troubles weren't just confined to Northern Ireland, right?
I'm talking about international relations.
Exactly. I mean, the British government's role was massive, but other countries, other organizations got involved as well.
The source mentions the Irish government, the United States, even the European Union.
And not everyone welcomed that involvement.
Right. Some argued the outside intervention actually made things worse, while others saw it as crucial to the peace process.
It goes to show that even conflicts that seem contained to one place can have global consequences.
And to solve them, you need cooperation on an international level. You need a deep, nuanced understanding of every player involved.
So much to unpack here. It feels overwhelming, honestly. How do you even begin to make sense of something as complex as the Troubles?
You're right, it's a lot to take in. One approach is to focus on specific events, like Bloody Sunday.
That was such a turning point, such a tragedy.
Absolutely. And this source goes beyond the headlines, really analyzes the causes, the effects, the long-term consequences of that day.
It's not just about knowing what happened, but understanding why it happened.
Exactly. Bloody Sunday, in many ways, became a microcosm of the entire conflict.
A stark reminder that even seemingly isolated incidents can have huge, far-reaching consequences.
And to grasp those consequences, we need to delve into the historical, political, and social forces at play.
Speaking of consequences, what about the Good Friday Agreement? Was it really the resolution to the Troubles, or is it more complicated than that?
Well, like most things related to this conflict, it's not simple. The Good Friday Agreement was monumental, no doubt.
It marked the official start of the peace process, right?
Exactly. It set up a framework for power sharing, for getting rid of weapons, for addressing the legacy of all that pain.
But it wasn't a cure-all.
No, the source doesn't sugarcoat that. There were still hurdles to overcome, setbacks to deal with.
Like the collapse of the Northern Ireland Assembly in 2002.
Right, and the fact that dissident paramilitary groups were still active even after the agreement. It was and still is a long, difficult journey.
So where does that leave Northern Ireland today? How has it all played out? What's the legacy of such a tumultuous period?
It's a legacy that's still being written, honestly. There's been progress, but also,
yes.
Definitely. The Good Friday Agreement provided a foundation, but those deep divisions in Northern Irish society, they didn't just vanish overnight.
It's a process.
Yeah.
We've touched on the psychological impact, the economic fallout, the cultural shifts. The Troubles really did affect every aspect of life there.
True. And one area we haven't really explored yet is the impact on education.
Interesting. How did schools, universities even function in such a divided society?
It's a crucial piece of the puzzle. I mean, we think of those institutions as places for learning, for growth, for open discussion.
In a place as fractured as Northern Ireland was during the Troubles, how did that actually play out?
That's a great question, and it's something the source material addresses directly. The education system in Northern Ireland was profoundly affected by the conflict.
It was already segregated along religious lines, right? Catholic schools, Protestant schools.
Exactly, and those divisions just deepened as the conflict escalated.
So kids were essentially getting different versions of history, different perspectives on what was happening right outside their doors.
It's definitely a possibility. The source doesn't go into specific curriculum details, but it highlights how that climate of fear, that pervasive mistrust, seeped into every corner of life.
Education included.
Absolutely. Even just going to school was dangerous for some kids.
The source mentions incidents of school buses being attacked, schools becoming bases for the military or police.
It's hard to imagine trying to learn to grow in that kind of environment. A whole generation robbed of its childhood, really. But even then, there were these amazing stories of resilience.
Of teachers, of students determined to learn, to hold on to hope.
Yes, that's the incredible part.
The source also mentions something called the integrated schools movement.
Oh, that was a fascinating development. It emerged during the Troubles, the idea being to create schools where Catholic and Protestant children learned together.
In such a polarized environment, that seems almost radical.
It was. There was resistance. definitely, from those who believed separate schools were essential to maintaining their community's identity.
But it took root.
It did, and it's continued to grow, especially since the Good Friday Agreement. A powerful example of how education, when done right, can bridge divides and foster a more inclusive society.
It's a good reminder that even in the darkest of times, there are always glimmers of hope, people working towards something better.
Absolutely.
The impact of the Troubles went beyond primary and secondary schools, though.
Right.
Universities were affected as well.
Oh, for sure. Universities in Northern Ireland became these microcosms of the wider conflict. Students and faculty often divided along sectarian lines.
The source mentions protests on campuses, clashes with police, even cases of academics censoring themselves out of fear.
Imagine trying to encourage free thought, open discussion, in an atmosphere where expressing an opinion could be dangerous.
Must have been a nightmare. Were there any signs of hope in the universities, like those integrated schools?
There were. Universities played a role in the peace process too, hosting dialogues, encouraging cross-community engagement, providing a space for people to reflect critically on what was happening.
So what's the big takeaway here? What can we learn from how the Troubles impacted education?
I think the main lesson is that education can be both a force for division and a force for unity.
Depends on how it's used.
Exactly. When it's used to reinforce those existing divisions, to promote fear and distrust, it can actually fuel conflict. But when it's used to bring people together, to help them understand each other, to foster empathy, it can be a powerful tool for building peace.
It really underscores the responsibility of educators, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Teachers, professors, administrators, they all have a role to play in shaping the minds of future generations, in creating a more just and peaceful world.
It reminds us that education isn't just about facts and figures. It's about critical thinking, encouraging open dialogue, challenging harmful biases.
And it's about recognizing that the legacy of conflict, while lasting, can be transformed.
Okay, before we move on, let's zoom out for a minute and talk about the media's role in all of this. They were right there, in the thick of it, reporting on this conflict as it unfolded.
Right, and the media's role was complex, often controversial.
It wasn't just about relaying the facts, was it?
No, the media had to navigate this incredibly intricate web of historical and political factors.
And those complexities often found their way into their reporting.
The source actually highlights how media coverage often mirrored the divide between nationalists and unionists.
It's like they were caught in the crossfire, too.
In a way, they were. This was a charged emotional conflict, and that inevitably influenced how it was presented to the public.
Was there bias in that reporting?
The source does point to accusations of bias from both sides.
I can imagine.
The nationalist press tended to be more sympathetic to the Republican cause, while the unionist press leaned toward the loyalist perspective.
Makes you wonder how much of what people knew about the Troubles was shaped by the particular media they consumed.
It's a crucial point. The media, for better or for worse, had a significant role in shaping public perception of this conflict.
So how do we as individuals sort through all these different narratives, these competing perspectives?
It's not easy. You have to consider your sources, be aware of potential biases, and seek out multiple...
It's like we talked about earlier. True understanding requires digging deeper, looking beyond the surface.
Precisely. And that's what we're doing here in this deep dive, trying to unpack this complex, multifaceted conflict.
Before we wrap up this first part, let's talk a bit more about the economic fallout of the Troubles. It wasn't just a social and political crisis, it had a real tangible impact on the economy.
Oh, absolutely. We're talking billions of pounds in damage.
Billions.
Yes. Infrastructure destroyed, security measures ramped up, lost productivity. The list goes on.
And that's just the direct costs.
Right. The indirect costs, things like the impact on tourism and foreign investment, those are harder to measure, but no less significant.
Staggering to think about the scale of that economic damage.
Conflict doesn't just destroy lives, it destroys livelihoods, communities, the very fabric of a society.
So how did businesses even function in this environment?
Honestly, many didn't. They were forced to close either because of the constant threat of violence or because the economic climate made it impossible to operate.
It must have taken incredible courage for those who managed to stay open.
It did. They had to adapt, find creative ways to navigate a war zone. The source actually mentions restaurants that started offering delivery services because people were too afraid to go out to eat.
Wow.
It was a scary time. And it wasn't just businesses that were affected. Employment skyrocketed, poverty increased, public services were pushed to the brink.
A vicious cycle.
Exactly. Violence led to economic instability, which then fueled more violence.
What happened after the Good Friday Agreement? Did the economy start to recover?
There was a sense of optimism, for sure. Violence decreased, and there was a renewed focus focus on rebuilding and investment. The British government pumped billions of pounds into regenerating areas hit hardest by the conflict.
Did it work?
It helped, definitely. It stimulated growth, but it was a slow process, and it wasn't evenly distributed. Some communities benefited more than others, and the scars of the conflict, both economic and psychological, remained.
You can't just erase decades of conflict overnight.
No, it takes more than money. It takes a fundamental shift in attitude, a willingness to move beyond the divisions of the past.
Was that kind of shift even possible?
That's the million-dollar question. There's been progress, but the economic landscape of Northern Ireland is still very much shaped by the legacy of the Troubles.
A reminder that the consequences of conflict can reverberate for generations.
Absolutely. Understanding those consequences, both economic and social, is key if we want to build a more peaceful and prosperous future. And it really underscores how crucial it is to understand the full picture, the economic consequences alongside the political and social upheaval.
Right, because it wasn't just about bombs and bullets. It was about people's livelihoods, their ability to put food on the table.
Exactly. And one area where that impact was particularly stark was in healthcare. Imagine trying to run a health service in the middle of a conflict zone.
That must have been incredibly challenging for both medical professionals and patients.
It was. Hospitals often found themselves quite literally caught in the crossfire. Bombings, shootings, the constant threat of violence. It all made it incredibly difficult for healthcare workers to do their jobs effectively and safely.
I read in the source material about a doctor who had to perform surgery while wearing a bulletproof vest.
That paints a pretty vivid picture, doesn't it? The level of stress, the pressure they were under. And it wasn't just the physical danger. The psychological toll was immense. Constant fear, uncertainty. It takes a toll on you.
Absolutely. And what about the patients? Imagine needing medical care in the middle of all that chaos.
Terrifying for everyone involved, to say the least. But, and this is the remarkable part, the health service in Northern Ireland persevered. They kept going, despite these incredible challenges.
They had to, I guess.
They did. And their commitment, their courage in the face of such adversity, it's truly inspiring. The source material emphasizes that they continue to provide care, often at great personal risk.
That's incredible. But the source also points out that the health service itself wasn't immune to the sectarian divisions that plagued Northern Ireland.
Sadly, that's true. Healthcare, like everything else, became politicized. Some hospitals were seen as being aligned with one community or the other, making it difficult for people to access the care they needed.
It's a reminder that conflict can seep into every aspect of life, even the most fundamental ones.
It's a stark illustration of that, for sure. And those divisions, they took a long time to heal, even after the Good Friday Agreement.
So how did the health service manage to cope with all these challenges?
They had to be adaptable, resourceful, and think outside the box. They developed new protocols for dealing with trauma, they trained staff in conflict resolution techniques, and they put in a lot of effort to build trust with communities.
It sounds like they were doing more than just providing medical care. They were actively contributing to the peace process in their own way.
In a sense, they were. They were on the front lines, seeing the human cost of the conflict every day. And as we've been discussing, that human cost extended far beyond physical injury. The psychological trauma of the Troubles was profound and long-lasting.
Absolutely. And it's not something that simply disappears when the fighting stops.
No, it's not. The trauma of the Troubles, it's left a deep and enduring mark on individuals, families, and entire communities.
What kind of trauma are we talking about specifically?
We're talking about a wide range of mental health issues. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, anxiety, depression, you name it.
And were these issues openly acknowledged and addressed at the time?
Not always, unfortunately. There was a culture of silence surrounding mental health, particularly among men. Admitting you were struggling was often seen as a sign of weakness.
Trying to cope with that level of trauma and silence, it must have been incredibly difficult.
It was, and it's one of the reasons why the legacy of the Troubles continues to affect Northern Ireland today.
But there are also stories of resilience, aren't there? Of people finding ways to heal and rebuild their lives.
Oh, absolutely. People found ways to cope, to heal, to move forward.
The source mentions community initiatives, support groups, and the arts playing a significant role in that healing process.
It's really inspiring to see how people found strength in shared experiences in their communities and in creative expression.
It's a powerful reminder that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit can endure and find ways to thrive.
And speaking of thriving, one area where that resilience was especially evident was in the arts.
Right, how the Troubles influenced art, music, literature, even film.
Exactly. It might seem counterintuitive, but something as horrific as the Troubles actually became a source of inspiration for many artists.
How does something so tragic inspire creativity?
I think it speaks to the power of art to process trauma, to find meaning amidst chaos. to offer a new perspective on difficult events.
The source mentions Seamus Heaney's poetry and U2's music as examples.
Yes, and there are countless others. There's this rich and diverse body of work that explores the Troubles from both personal and political perspectives.
Art became a way for people to grapple with the complexity of the conflict, to express their emotions, to connect with others who shared their experiences.
And it wasn't just about reflecting on the past. It was about envisioning a different future, using art as a tool for peace and reconciliation.
Always a need for hope, especially in times like those.
Absolutely. Hope and the power of human creativity to transcend even the darkest of chapters.
Speaking of transcending dark chapters, the peace process itself, leading up to the Good Friday Agreement, that was a long and difficult journey.
It was. Decades of negotiations, setbacks, breakthroughs. It took a lot to get to that point.
The source material does a great job of detailing the key events and figures that shaped the process.
It highlights the roles of political leaders, community activists, and international mediators.
And it wasn't just about high-level diplomacy. It was about grassroots efforts, people-to-people dialogue, a collective desire for peace.
It's a reminder that lasting peace can't be imposed from above. It has to be built from the ground up.
But even with the Good Friday Agreement, the journey wasn't over, was it?
No, not at all. There were still hurdles to overcome, divisions to mend, a whole legacy of trauma to address.
The source mentions the collapse of the Northern Ireland Assembly in 2002, the continued activity of dissident paramilitary groups, and the ongoing debate about how to deal with the past.
It's a fragile process, building peace, and it requires constant effort, constant vigilance.
So, given everything we've discussed, where does that leave Northern Ireland today? What's the legacy of the Troubles? How are they grappling with all that has happened?
It's a complicated legacy, one that continues to evolve. There's been progress, definitely, but there's still challenges to overcome. The Good Friday Agreement provided a framework for peace, but it didn't magically erase the divisions in Northern Irish society.
We've talked about the psychological impact, the economic fallout, the cultural shifts.
Yeah.
It seems like every aspect of life was touched by the Troubles.
That's very true. And one area we haven't explored yet is the impact on education. How did schools and universities function in such a divided society? What was it like for students and teachers trying to navigate that environment?
Yeah, it's a really interesting aspect to consider. Ideally, schools and universities should be places where young people can learn and grow, where open dialogue is encouraged. But in a society as divided as Northern Ireland was during the Troubles, it's hard to imagine how that could actually work.
The source material paints a pretty stark picture. It suggests that the education system in Northern Ireland was deeply affected by the conflict, both structurally and in its day-to-day operation. Oh, absolutely. I mean, even before the Troubles erupted, you had a system that was already largely segregated along religious lines. Catholic schools, Protestant schools, often operating almost completely separately from one another.
So the Troubles essentially just amplified those existing divisions.
Yes, in many ways they did. They reinforced that separation between communities, and that was reflected in the schools.
Does that mean that kids were basically being taught different versions of history, different perspectives on the conflict itself?
It's definitely a possibility. The source doesn't go into specifics about the curriculum, but it does highlight how that climate of fear and mistrust that we talked about earlier, it permeated every aspect of life, including education.
It must have been incredibly challenging for teachers to create a neutral learning environment when all this was going on outside the classroom.
It was. And for students, even just going to school could be a risky proposition. The source mentions instances of school buses being hijacked or burned, even schools being used as bases by the military or the police.
It's a reminder that this wasn't just an abstract political conflict. It was something that directly impacted the lives of children and families.
It's a heartbreaking reality. But even in those incredibly difficult circumstances, there were stories of incredible teachers and students who were determined to keep learning, to keep growing, to hold on to hope for a better future.
The source material also mentions the integrated schools movement that emerged during the Troubles.
Oh, yes. That was a really significant development. The whole idea behind integrated schools was to bring Catholic and Protestant children together in a shared learning environment.
In such a polarized society, that must have seemed radical at the time.
It was, and it faced a lot of opposition, particularly from those who felt that maintaining separate schools was essential to protecting their community's identity.
But the movement persisted.
It did, and it's actually grown quite a bit since the Good Friday Agreement. It's a really powerful example of how education, when done right, can help to bridge divides and contribute to a more inclusive society.
It's like they were planting the seeds for a different kind of future, a future where those divisions might not be so deeply entrenched.
Exactly. And the impact of the Troubles wasn't just limited to primary and secondary schools. Universities were affected as well.
Right, they became almost like microcosms of the wider conflict, didn't they?
They did. Students and faculty were often divided along sectarian lines. There were protests, clashes with the police, even cases of academics censoring themselves out of fear of reprisal.
The source mentions that, yeah. Imagine trying to encourage open dialogue and critical thinking in an environment where expressing certain opinions could put you at risk.
It was a challenging time, to say the least. But just like with the integrated schools movement, there were also signs of hope within universities. They played a role in the peace process too, hosting dialogues, promoting cross-community engagement, providing a platform for critical reflection on the conflict.
So what can we learn from all this? What's the key takeaway here about the impact of the Troubles on education?
I think the most important lesson is that education can be both a tool for division and a tool for unity. It really depends on how it's used. When it's used to reinforce existing divisions, to promote fear and mistrust, it can actually exacerbate conflict. But when it's used to bring people together, to foster understanding and empathy, it can be a powerful catalyst for peace and reconciliation.
So it's not just about what's being taught, it's about how it's being taught. It's about creating an environment where students feel safe to express themselves, to challenge ideas, to engage in meaningful dialogue.
Exactly. And that places a huge responsibility on educators, on teachers, professors, administrators. They all have a role to play in shaping young minds, in fostering a more just and peaceful world.
Well said. Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive into the Troubles, I think it's safe to say that we've covered a lot of ground.
We have. We've explored the historical roots of the conflict, delved into the political and religious divisions, examined the role of paramilitary groups, and looked at the impact on everyday life.
We've talked about the economy, healthcare, the arts, and education. It's clear that the Troubles were a time of tremendous suffering, violence, and division. But it's also a story of courage, resilience, and the enduring human spirit.
And it's a reminder that the legacy of conflict can be complex and long-lasting. But it's not a fixed thing. It can be transformed.
There are still challenges to overcome, wounds to heal, and a shared future to build in Northern Ireland. But there's also a sense of hope, a belief that a different future is possible, a future where peace and reconciliation prevail.
It's a future worth striving for.
If you're interested in learning more about the Troubles, there are a ton of resources available, both online and in library. You can also find some excellent books on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We hope it's given you a better understanding of this complex and often overlooked.
Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep searching for the truth.